say, with new, and the actual total size of memory you were wanting was therefore n times s. So you're allocating n objects of size s, and the multiplication n times s would overflow, and you would end up allocating a very small buffer. So from Visual Studio 2005, the compiler inserts code automatically that will check that that implicit multiplication doesn't overflow. And if it does, then it will try and get you to allocate 2 gigabytes of memory, which will typically fail. Okay, so around 2007, Windows Vista arrives, and it has a number of additional mitigations on top of that. Address layout randomization is a much more comprehensive form of randomizing those fixed values. So as an attacker, if you know exactly what the memory layout is going to be, that's going to make your job a whole lot easier. You know exactly what address to call or virtual protect. You know exactly where a whole bunch of fixed pointers are located in memory. ASLR introduces some entropy, so each boot, the actual memory layout is slightly different. And we also made a whole bunch of extra heat mitigations, largely driven by MSRC cases that had happened. One of the main ones, I guess, that was important for us was terminate on heap corruption. So whereas before, if the heap was corrupted, the kernel could detect that, but it would probably just decide to struggle on as best it could. And that was probably a bad idea, and we realized it was a bad idea from years of bitter experience with people exploiting heap bugs. So now if the kernel detects that the heap's been corrupted, it will terminate the process, assuming you've opted in which Windows modules read. Okay, what can the attacker do? Well, of course, he can try and evade ASLR. So he can try and find instances where ASLR isn't applied. So, in particular, the ASLR randomization of memory is really just affecting the top few bits of the memory address. So if you have some partial overwrite, where you overwrite just the top bits of memory, then actually you can end up getting to reasonably, you can reliably go to a fixed address. So for example, suppose you know that there's an address that is hex AAAA and then some other 4 digits. Well, the AAAA bit is maybe what ASLR randomizes. So if you're able to overwrite the AAAA, then you know exactly what the rest of it's going to be. Ironically, by introducing SLR, we kind of introduced a new class of bug, address information disclosure. Before, no one really cared where things were in the address space. Now that ASLR is there, suddenly, if you're able to disclose memory layout information, then that could be leveraged to then in other attacks. Again, lots of references on well-known ways of exploiting those. I mentioned before about the environment becoming more constrained, and I guess that this is worth reiterating that for Vista. ASLR and the depth and heap improvements in Vista, were significant, and although you could still exploit, it did make the attacker's job a lot harder. And there's some evidence of that based on a number of exploits that we've seen on Vista versus previous operating systems. Vista SQ1 Server 2008, C-hop overwrite protection. So I mentioned before about overwriting exception handlers, and one of the main problems we had was if you overwrite an exception handler that claims to be registered in some third-party module that hasn't been built with, say, SEH, then the system would have no way of knowing whether that was valid or not. So what C-hop does is when you throw an exception, it will walk the entire chain of exceptions. So each exception has kind of a pointer to the next handler in the exception handling chain. So that's kind of, so you have kind of a backwards pointer to the previous one, a pointer to the next handler and then an address of the current handler. Now, if you walk forward to the end of that chain, you should only be going through valid exception handlers. And so all Seahawk does is it will walk through that chain and check that it gets to some known good address at the end. If it doesn't get to that known good address at the end, then it knows that one of the exception handlers in the middle is bad, and therefore it can avoid executing those. Seahawk isn't on by default though, so this is something you'd have to opt into. Vista SP1 Server 2008 also increased the amount of kernel mode, the entropy in the kernel mode ASLR. So this is just kind of a summary of the kind of few years from pre-XP, SP2, where things are really bad, and a number of things that we did between then and Vista shipping. So, all that to say that by the time Vista shipped, I guess we were probably feeling reasonably confident. We've got GS considerably improved. We significantly increased the difficulty of user mode exploitation by def and ASLR and Vista. And in Windows 7, we wanted to further improve kernel mode mitigations. We'd had a run of kernel mode cases, and so that was an area that seemed like it needed some attention. So pool overruns is kind of the kernel mode equivalent of heap overruns. And what we glossed over before, a header of a block of memory on the heap has a pointer to the previous block and a pointer to the next block of memory on the heap. And in the same way, there's that kind of similar structure in the kernel mode pool. And typically what an attacker will do is overwrite that header data with some arbitrary data of his own. Now, sorry, to go back to that. So the chunk header contains a pointer to the previous block and a pointer to the next block. So if I've got a pointer to the next block, then I can go and look at that previous block and check that